We're going to assemble and install our Eco rear rack. In your box, you should have one top plate, two support arms, a riser bracket, and a taillight bracket. Okay, for our Eco rear rack hardware, we have 3 different lengths of M5 bolts. We have washers and lock nuts. We also have 3 cable tie holders, as well as 3 zip ties and 2 spacers. Step 1 is to attach our top plate to each of our support arms. You'll notice that there's a tab on our top plate, and that goes to the front, which is this orientation here. To assemble, we're going to use our shortest M5 bolts, which are 16 millimeters long. Those are going to go through the top plate with no washer, through the support arm, and then we'll secure it on the bottom with a washer and a lock nut. And there's 3 on each side for 6 total. So I'm gonna start them all by hand. Once I have them all started, I'll tighten them down using hand tools. I find it easier to start a couple of them at a time to keep things aligned. Get a washer and a nut on the bottom. Once these are started, I'll do the other side the same way. We don't recommend power tools because these are stainless and they're more prone to galling. So hand tools are the best way to assemble this. All right, I've got these 3 started. I'm gonna go ahead and start the bolts on the other side, and then I'll tighten them all at once. For our left side, there's an additional step, which is adding the 3 cable tie holders to the bottom side, which is gonna be underneath the washer and the nut. And what that does is allow us to secure the cable running to the tail light. So to do that, we're going to place our bolt through the top plate, through the support arm. While holding that in place, we're gonna place in our cable tie holder, and then I'm gonna tilt this into position and then place a washer, and I'll start the nut. And we'll do that with all 3 bolts along the left side. Again, that's bolt first, then the cable tie holder, a washer, and then the nut. Last one, same thing, bolt, cable tie holder, washer, and nut. As we tighten these, before we get it too tight, we'll want to make sure that we orient these in a position that allows us to get a zip tie through. As I start to get this tight, I want to make sure that I press the cable tie holder parallel with this rail, and that will allow us to get our zip tie through in line with our cable. Holding the zip tie anchor into the correct position or close to it. Again, before it gets too tight, just readjust that and then tighten it down all the way. Good, one more. Okay, that's the main structure of our rack put together. We want to make sure that we've got all the hardware snug, and we want to ensure that our cable tie holders are in a direction that allows you to easily get a zip tie through and around the taillight cable. Step 2 on the assembly of the Eco rear rack is to install the riser bracket. You'll notice it has slotted holes, and we're going to align one of those slotted holes with the tab on the top plate. To assemble this, we're going to use the same hardware that we used to attach the top. It's going to go through that hole, through the slot in the riser, and then a washer and a nut go on the back side. I'm gonna flip this over to install it. All right, I've got the hardware started. So now I'm gonna get it snug, but not tight. And that's gonna allow me to make sure that I center it. So when we put it on the bike, it's easy to align. On this step, a socket, an 8mm socket on the nut will definitely make it a little bit easier, but it can be done with a wrench. Okay, I've got this riser just about tight, And now is when I want to make sure that it is straight. I don't want it to be crooked as I tighten it down. I want to make sure that it's straight and relatively centered in this slot. And that's going to give us the best chance of making sure everything aligns when we install it on the bike. That's it. That's step 2 done. Now on to step 3. Step 3 is installing the taillight bracket onto the rear of the rack. And to do that, we'll align the holes in the top plate with the taillight bracket. We're going to use the same hardware that we used before. Get that started, and then once we have both bolts started with washers and nuts on the bottom, then we'll go ahead and tighten that down. Okay, both bolts are started. We'll just tighten those with our 8mm socket and our 3mm hex key. Okay, so that is our Eco rear rack fully assembled. Before continuing, we want to just double check that we didn't forget to tighten anything. We don't want any rattles on the bike. But if everything looks good, then we're ready to install it. If your bike came with a rack and you want to install the Eco rear rack, you got to remove that. So the first step is going to be to remove the battery from the bike. So we've got the battery off and unlocked. So we'll just give that a pull and we'll set this aside. Now that our battery is removed and we've got some room to work, the second step is to remove the taillight so that we can reuse it on the other rack. To do that, I've got my snips. I'm going to carefully take care of each of the zip ties, taking care not to cut the wiring. So there's 1, 2, 3, and we've got one on the upright post over here. So I'm just gonna carefully snip that one. So we've got each of the zip ties removed. I'm just gonna pull those out. Be careful not to scratch yourself. They can be sharp. Once our wiring is free, we're gonna find the connector, grab it firmly, and separate the 2 halves. All right, so there's our tail light disconnected. We're gonna pull this end out of the way for now. And we've got to remove 2 nuts on the back side of this tail light. We're gonna keep that hardware because we're gonna reuse it. To remove the tail light, we're gonna take these 2 nuts off. We're gonna keep the hardware. That's an 8mm wrench I've got. If you've got a ratcheting one, even better. You can also use an 8mm socket for this. So there's one side removed. Remember to hang on to that washer and that lock nut. So we'll set that aside. As this starts to get loose, you want to make sure you're hanging on to the tail light. You don't want that to fall. So that is our tail light removed. We've got the hardware. We're going to keep that together. We'll set this aside as we pull the rack off. We're ready to remove this rack off the bike. To do that, we've got 2 bolts down low and 1 up top that goes through the tube on the frame. That's going to be a 4mm hex to grab onto the bolt. On the inside of this one, we'll need an 8mm wrench. To make things a little easier, I'm going to use a 4mm socket adapter. So I'll start with, all right, got that off. I'm going to put the washer and then nut back on that bolt so we can keep that with this rack in case we want to reuse it in the future. Now on to the 2 lower bolts, and we're gonna make sure that we keep a hand on the rear of the rack because as we start to loosen these, it is gonna wanna drop. So carefully loosening that. That's one side off. Switching to the other side. Again, making sure to support the rack so it doesn't swing out of the way. As it gets loose, maybe we can set that down, let it rest on the tire, hold it there. And that's it. That's our rear rack removed. I've got my assembled Eco rear rack. I've got my taillight that I removed from the other rack. So now it's time to install this. We've got this off the bike. It can be done after the rack is installed. We're just making it a little easier on ourselves right now. So this will simply press the 2 bolts through the slots in the taillight bracket, and we've saved our hardware that was used to attach it to the other rack. So I'll just start each of these. Once I've got that on, you'll notice that these holes are slotted. So just want to eyeball it center, and then we're going to tighten the nuts with an 8mm wrench. All right, everything's still centered. That one's starting to get a little bit snug. So we can move on to the other side. All right, that one's snug. That one is also snug. You want to take care not to over tighten that because we don't want to damage the light. So now we've got our cable, and if you remember from assembling the rear rack, we have our cable tie holders. So we're gonna go ahead and get our zip ties ready. So I like to bend the end of that just to help it get through and point up. And we'll get each of these ready. There's 2, and we can kind of see how this is gonna route. We're gonna lay that down there. The 3rd one is just gonna be close to the connector. We'll probably wait to tighten this one down until we're on the bike, but we can go ahead and put the zip tie in place. All right, that's all 3 zip ties in place. We can start clasping the zip ties, making sure that the cable is inside of them. I'm not gonna tighten it all the way yet, because we might need to move things around when it's on the bike, and we can always tighten these and trim them later. So for now, that's good enough. We can still move the cable, and we're ready to install our rack with our taillight onto the bike. Okay, I've got my Eco rear rack ready to install on the bike. I've got the hardware that came with it ready here. That is a very long M5, and that is gonna go through the riser, through this hole in the frame, and utilize a washer and a nut on the inside. And we have 4 shorter M5s, and that's going to use our original mount point from the other rack down here. And if your bike is one of the newer bikes that has the extra bolt holes along the frame here, it's gonna utilize the rearmost one on each side. So to make sure that we can do that, we're going to remove the existing bolts. That's a 4mm. So we'll start with that. Set that aside, remove the other one. This is only the rearmost bolt. This one is not utilized for the rack. That's for other accessories that you might want to add. So we're only going to remove this one for now. All right, that's it. Here's our 2 connection points that are going to be utilized on each side, along with the hole in the rear of the frame. Okay, so we've got our rack ready to put it on the bike. So we're going to flex the front, make sure it slips outside of the frame, and we're going to align the slot with the threaded hole where the previous rack was installed, and we're just going to get that started by hand. Once that's started, we'll continue on the other side, same thing, through the slot into the threaded hole. Once that's started, we're going to give it a few more turns with a 3mm. Always make sure that bolts are going in smoothly. You don't want to cross thread them. And we're going to get this one almost tight, but we want to make sure that we can still see a gap. So we're leaving about 1mm on that side and this side. And that's going to make sure that we can get everything aligned and all the hardware in before anything gets tightened. All right, almost tight, but not quite. Now we can rotate the rack, making sure that our taillight wire is out of the way. You can see that's gonna come up, and because of our slots, we can move this around and align the other slots and mounting locations. So I'm gonna move to the other side. There are 2 spacers, and these are important because we wanna bring the plane of the mounting holes out to the same level as how it mounts on the bottom. So we'll bring that up. We're gonna put a spacer on the inside, put the bolt through the outside. That is just gonna get a couple of turns to make sure it can't come out. This one's probably gonna be the trickiest one because we have to get it pressed in between the rack and the frame. It's not too difficult. I'm already done. So now I'm just lifting things up so that I can get that started, and I did. I'll give that a few turns on each side. No reason to tighten that all the way yet because we still have 1 bolt to go. Okay, our final bolt is going to go through the slot in the riser, through the frame, and then we'll have a washer and a nut on the inside, and all that hardware comes with the rack. Again, we've got slotted holes so that we can make some adjustments now. So that one is good enough. We'll push that through. That'll hold in place. We'll put our washer and our nut on the inside, and we'll tighten that with a 3mm hex and an 8mm wrench on the inside. You want to make sure that your battery is removed for this. You won't be able to reach the nut otherwise. Okay, that's our first one, snug. If your bike doesn't have the extra threaded holes in the frame right here, you'll only be using the lower front slots and the hole in the back of the frame. Everything else is installed exactly the same way. So now that that one's tight, we can move on. Maybe just double check how things look as far as the spacing in the slot to the screw. You kind of want to make sure that's equal on both sides. So I'm just going to give that a peek, and we'll get that snug. Again, it's going into aluminum threads. You don't want to use a long wrench. You don't want to put a lot of torque on this. It won't take much. So wrist tight there. Same thing on the bottom here. Good. Heat on the other side. That feels good. Same thing here. And our final step, you'll notice that you have 2 additional 5mm washers and nuts, and those go on the inside of these lower bolts. And that's just some extra security to make sure that those bolts never come loose. All right, that's it. Our last 2 nuts are tight. The rack is fully mounted, so now we need to connect the taillight. We're gonna get that started with our connector inside. Once that's started, make sure that we're orienting the connector properly. There's a little pin that aligns on each side. So you wanna make sure you have a good hold of both sides. Once we feel that align, just press firmly. Make sure it's fully seated. And now we can double check our routing of our wire, and we're gonna snug those zip ties to hold that cable in place. This zip tie, I'm gonna go ahead and put right around the connecting pieces, and that's gonna keep that out of the way well. Take your time to make sure that this is done right, so you don't have to mess with it in the future. That looks pretty good to me. So I'll grab my snips, snip off the end of those zip ties, and we're good. That's it. That's your Eco rear rack fully installed. We've got our taillight connected. We've double checked that all of our hardware is tightened. Give it a once over. After that first ride, go ahead and double check, make sure nothing's coming loose. And after that, you should be good to go.